Hi, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that short break. We're going to move on to our next session now. This will be led by Dr. Julie Reddy from South Africa, South African Qualifications Authority in South Africa. I want to quickly introduce Julie to you, and then Julie will take over the session by introducing her panel members. I think many of you here and around the world already know Reddy. She's currently the Chief Executive Officer of SAQA. She has worked in SAQA in senior management positions since October 2012. And for 9 years prior to joining SAQA, she was the Managing Director of Africa Skills Development, a project management and enterprise training development agency. Between 2000 and 2005, Dr. Reddy was the founding CEO of the chemical SETA, Sector Education Training Authority, and also the CEO of the Secondary Agriculture SETA. Dr. Reddy currently serves as a council member for the 3 quality councils, the Council on Higher Education, the Qualifications, Quality Council for Trades and Occupations, and Umalusi in South Africa. She's also appointed to the National Skills Authority and the Human Resources Development Council. Internationally, Dr. Reddy is on the board of directors of the Groningen Declaration Network, board of directors, and a UNESCO-appointed international juror for its Learning City Award. Her academic qualifications include both an MSc as a Fulbright Scholar and a PhD from Cornell University in the United States. So Dr. Reddy will be addressing us on the aspect of credentials, which was touched upon very briefly by Dr. Boreen Chakran earlier this morning. And I hand you over to Dr. Reddy now. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Roxana, and thank you to Jet and Mercita for this opportunity. I just made sure that I was unmuted. Thank you to Jet and the Mercita for this opportunity to speak on this important topic, which, as Roxana said, it was addressed in one of the keynotes, so it's already garnering much attention because it's an important topic for us, not only in South Africa, but internationally. Especially in the realm of recognition. So the topic is credentials and micro-credentials. And what do these mean for the South African NQF space? Before I go into the topic, I was just talking to the panel a little earlier and saying, it is very hard to talk about these issues in education training with another global crisis facing us. The world is in such disarray so soon after the global pandemic. And on behalf of the panel, we'd like to keep the people of Ukraine in our prayers and in our hearts, and just really hope that this does not escalate into an international, war or whatever has happened in the past. But history, is a real determinant of how we live. So just to put it in context. But anyway, to go back to the topic, I'd like to expand on something James raised in the chat earlier, a question he asked. When we're thinking about this topic, can we consider, or I'm taking some license, imagine a new context where credentials and micro-credentials, which is an important link to it, are more than qualifications or parts thereof. And I know Dr. Chakran raised a point. He said maybe we must look at our lens again through which we view qualifications and credentials, and of course also micro-credentials. And maybe it is also important while you're listening to this Q&A session, because that's what it is primarily, that we take a more expansive view and lens and look at learning outcomes rather than the output, the end result, which is your qualification certificate and your transcript. So with that, I would like to just introduce our esteemed panelists, and then I will move on into the session. So firstly, we have Herman de Loo, and Herman is the initiator and executive director of the Groningen Declaration Network, an international public benefit foundation registered with the Netherlands Chamber of Commerce. Herman is passionate about putting citizens in control over their own data sets. I think this point came out earlier, Herman, about people exercising their own agency, and which is very focused on bringing together a person's formal, non-formal, and informal education attainments and professional experiences in what he calls a digital learning currency of a person, which people may access at their own discretion and have control over. Next, I want to introduce John Hart. John comes with an extensive credential list, and he's an independent education and training consultant since he left his post as head of the qualification strategy with the Scottish Qualifications Authority, one of the first entities to put an NQF out there, and we have learned a lot from the Scottish qualifications framework. He played a leading role in establishing what is now being called the Scottish Credits and Qualifications Framework. He has worked extensively internationally, including in Africa. And since 2015, John has been the leader on the development of a system of world reference levels for UNESCO and the design of a digital tool for users of the world reference level system. Most recently, he's been working with a number of countries on introducing coherence and consistency in their NQF level descriptors. He is also working on a very exciting project and supporting the World Health Organization Academy to set up a global competency framework for universal health coverage, which is using the world reference levels and a framework for recognition of learning and the awarding of credential. John has published extensively, and we look forward to his input. Last but not least, a fellow South African, Vijayan Naidu, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Quality Council for Trades and Occupations, a position he has held since June 2017. Previously, Vijayan was the Chief Director for Occupational Quality Assurance at the QCTO, and before that, he worked in a senior management position for quality assurance and assessment with Umalusi, the Council for General and Further Education and Training. Mr. Naidu has almost 30 years of experience in education and training sector, where he has held various senior positions. He also, like me, serves on the board of the NQF entities. He's on the board of SAQA. He sits on the National Skills Authority and the Quality Councils, as well as various task teams and structures which contribute to key development and implementation structures in the education and training space. His area of expertise are in quality assurance and assessment. So we welcome our three panelists and look forward to their inputs. I am going to move now to just sharing with you my views of credentials and micro-credentials and what they mean for the South African NQF space. I'm then going to move on to pose some questions to our panelists to just, generate the discussion, and hopefully then we will engage with you, and I'm sure it'll lead to robust discussions and views being shared. So in my personal capacity, since credentials and micro-credentials have been on the radar and have been in the global and national discussions in the education and training space, I have really grappled with these terms in terms of their meaning and how they are being used. So I did a Google search, and I want to share with you a definition that's there because I think it needs to be kept at the back of my mind when we're dealing with this topic. It is defined as a qualification, but more than a qualification, also an achievement, a quality or aspect of a person's background, especially when used to indicate their suitability for something. Currently, there is no common definition of a micro-credential, but since it's a derivative of credentials, I think the same sort of descriptors apply. So for me, current education systems and employment recruitment practices still focus almost exclusively on formally acquired and recognized full qualifications, rather than other forms of credential. It's a point James made earlier in the chat. Many countries in Europe and North America in particular appear to confine their narrative on credentials. There's a common term of credential evaluation, and now micro-credentials to a narrow viewpoint premised, in my view, on traditional and linear academic educational thinking that only learning, which is quality assured, formally assessed, and certified as a qualification or a credit has merit and deserves consideration. In my view, and in South Africa, in my conversations with colleagues in the space, many of us hold the view that qualifications and or credits only reference some of the aspects of a more expansive basket of non and informal credentials and micro-credentials. And therefore, we are asking that they should be qualified as such. This view, I believe, is premised on the reality that while a person's learning journey over a lifetime is cumulative, it is seldom linear. We know from our own personal learning journeys that many of our competencies, attributes, and skills are accumulated most often in haphazard and unintentional ways through a diverse nexus of non-formal and informal, mostly self-directed learning pathways. The evidence for this is showcased most clearly in a person's biography, curriculum vitae, their resumes, which spotlights not only formal qualifications, but also other achievements and competencies and attributes, leaving the reader to determine suitability for something. In other words, concluding that recognition of learning and other credentials is determined by the recognizer. So based on that, I want to pose some questions to our panelists. So firstly, I'm going to start with John and then move over to Vijayan and then Herman. So panelists, what are your views on the ideas I have posited just now? That there is more to learning that needs to be recognized and acknowledged as credentials rather than the current overemphasis on formal qualifications. Over to you, John.
Unmuted, I'll now say thank you, Julie. It's a very rich question you're asking, full of all sorts of complexities and overlaps between ideas. And so I want to actually give an answer which is both broad and in a sense conservative. It seems to me that in moving to an outcomes-based system, as we did and you did many years ago, you open up the possibility for recognizing all sorts of different achievement, as long as it can be stated in outcome terms. And indeed, the problem that I encountered in a number of countries that I was working in and setting up qualification frameworks is that there isn't really an idea of how anybody could have an achievement which is as broadly defined as that. The European qualification framework offered a definition of a qualification which was the formal outcome of an assessment and validation process obtained when a competent body determines that an individual has achieved learning outcomes to given standards. And in fact, I think South Africa had, in the SAQA Act, a similar definition dating right back to 1995. And if you read that one way, then that definition, which was adopted in a lot of places because people have been looking for kind of international standards that they can adopt, and looking in all sorts of places for such standards. And if you look at that definition, then it leaves things very open, but it also allows you to be very, very tight and very restrictive in it. I mean, it depends, for example, how you define a competent body. And in some countries, that's the ministry, end of story, their qualifications count and so on. So on the one hand, my answer is yes. We should be exploiting all the opportunities of outcomes-based qualifications, or credentials, rather. On the other hand, I want to just pose the question, why is it that formal qualifications are seen as so important and given such wide recognition? And I think there are two possible answers, or two main answers. One is that people are sometimes just conservative and restrictive and want to look after their own interests as represented in the system as it stands. And that can be the case. But I think it's also true that if you think about what the job of gatekeepers and recruiters, employers, how are they to find their way through the maze of credentials, which already exists and is growing? I'll come back to that in answer to another question. But in America, I've seen a reckoning, which is something like there are 1 million credentials currently available in America. And I think there are values in the formal qualifications which we need to understand and take account of when we're trying to broaden the system out a bit. The other thing that needs to be looked at, of course, is implementation. And my late colleague, David Rafe, always said that whilst there is the logic of the qualifications, there's also institutional logic in the organizations that award, deliver, assess, and so on. And that also needs to be taken account of. So that's my ambiguous answer, Julie, to your very interesting question.
Thank you, John. I've heard the most famous quote of 2021-22 is that you are muted. So it works for me too, because it's difficult to keep tabs. Vijayan, over to you, to your response.
Thank you, Julie, and to the fellow panelists as well as those on the platform. Yeah, as John indicated, I think what you presented to us really is a very comprehensive view of the challenge at hand. For me, I think the issue, and I'm going to be giving a very pragmatic view to this the questions posed, is that I think we need to really interrogate the form and the substance of what we're talking about, both when we talk about the qualifications, the credentials, or the micro credentials. And in essence, what I'm saying is, are we actually talking about the same thing as qualifications, part qualifications, etc., just in a different form, or does the one complement the other? Now, in the context of South Africa, as in many other countries, and I think it links to what John indicated, the emphasis on a formal qualification. And I think because of the historical context, everybody aspires to a qualification, irrespective of even the background that you are coming from. And in the South African context, where there's limited access to university spaces, etc. There is the scramble towards this formal qualification because socially it has a particular meaning or standing. So I think part of the challenge then, if we have to start to talk about credentialing and micro-credentialing as being part of a process getting towards a qualification, that's the critical substance that I'm talking about. And the form that it takes is the issue of the credentials or the micro-credentials. So the issue is also within the South African context. Is this credentialing and micro-credentialing a way for us to recognize prior knowledge that has been obtained, the knowledge and the skills, and for what it is worth in itself? Is it worth just for self-sustainability? Does it have worth for the individual in terms of self-employment or even leading to employment? Or does it also constitute recognition towards a pathway that will eventually culminate in what we call a full qualification, or in what we know in other countries are now being called the credential? And so for me, that is, the challenge that we have. And I want to link this, especially again in the South African context, that is this a new debate that we're introducing? Have we learned any lessons from the unit standard-based system that we had, which was in some sense a form of micro-credentialing, but which didn't exactly pan out or work out the way it was intended to be. So my approach to this whole question of credentialing and micro-credentialing is it a replacement? Is it complementary, so that the system does not become overcomplicated, especially within the context that we find ourselves in South Africa? And let me just conclude this part by saying that industry, it certainly seems, has an appetite for this element called micro-credentialing or credentialing, because it focuses on a specific skill which industry would require. While on the other hand, those of us that look at this more academically, or within the constructs of an NQF, would probably overcomplicate what might be a much more simpler issue viewed by industry. I think that I'll stop there for now, Julie.
Thank you so much, Vijayan. Over to you, Herman, for your input.
Always not the enviable position to be the last to comment, because John and Vijayan have already covered that much. To me, it seems that the terminology sometimes is that important. A credential basically is something that attests to what someone has achieved. It could be a macro credential, a micro credential. In a way, they are envelopes. They stand for a certain amount of learning accomplished. While at the same time, qualification may not necessarily be the same thing, because to me, coming from the background of a credential evaluation agency, a qualification meets the requirements of a certain professional licensing body, most clearly in the case of medicine, but physical therapy, there are a number of professions that basically require a qualification. Now, I may be quite free to discuss it this way. I am fully aware that in the South African context, it might be that you don't deal that easily with these terms because they may have very distinct connotations. But nevertheless, I think for the discussion, it might be useful to simply draw the line between, well, anything that someone does, we can capture either in formal or non-formal, informal learning on the one hand, but it does not necessarily always mean that it is the one document that will get you to a certain position. That being said, I think micro-credentials come in their own right when a person has achieved his first position in his employment history. We all know that there is something like an entry qualification to get you where you want to be, a starting position. But haven't we all witnessed the fact that while you may have been trained as a chemist or a physician or whatever, after 20-30 years, you're no longer working in the same field. And this is where micro-credentials, the whole issue of non-formal, informal learning becomes so important because organizations really require people that possess soft skills, very specific skills. There's a need in all organizations, in society as a whole, for these credentials. I will leave it at that for the moment. But Julie, please surprise us with your next question if you can.
Yeah, Herman, I'm going to leave you to answer the next question first. So it's just a continuation. I mean, I want to drill down. How would you define credentials and micro-credentials in terms of how these terms might be used within an NQF space? Because that's the thing we are grappling with in South Africa. What are your views on that?
There is this term macro-credential, not opposed to, but what you call as a complement to micro-credential. Macro-credentials, as defined recently by Beverly Oliver, would mean any prolonged block of educational attainment that is formally approved, quality assured. Typically, you are thinking of bachelor degrees, master's degrees, or teaching qualifications. Micro-credentials may be part of a macro-credential. They may actually be one semester being part of a road towards a bachelor degree, but at the same time, they may also sit somewhere else. So that's the confusing part. While the most qualification framework systems that we know have been devised to deal with the whole series of educational levels like general secondary education, vocational and technical secondary education, and then higher education, bachelor, master, that's easy. Micro-credentials were not consistently thought of to fit in the system. I think the systems will have to accommodate themselves to fit in the micro-credentials, because it may happen that they, what you call, do not easily fit in any system at all. But since there is this societal need for them, there is this societal appreciation for what they can bring for organizations, for persons, there simply is the need to rethink qualification systems, qualification frameworks. And I'm happy if I may take my cue from the order in which you asked the questions, that John might be the next one that you want to ask your next question.
Yeah, thank you, Herman. John, yes, please go ahead.
I'm very, well, if I can start by saying, in answer to the last question, I was talking about the struggle to find a definition for the term qualification. And even when we had that, we were left with this ragbag of other things, which might be called supplementary or part qualifications or whatever. And different countries had different ways of describing and dealing with that. And very often terms had to be invented. I was really unaware of the term credentials until a few years ago. It's not a term we use at all. And in working with the world reference levels, I adopted the phrase which I still use now, which is qualifications and other forms of credential. And there's a question mark over what exactly these are. I find the term microcredential very unhelpful. It's a distraction, more associated really with marketing than conceptual analysis. And I would ask the question of microcredentials this: does it mean more than a small qualification or other form of credential normally delivered online? And that'd be fine. We would understand what it was, but that definition would not help us, and I'll explain why, to decide whether these go in the qualifications frameworks or are recognized for purpose A or purpose B or so on. I would also add that I'm very alarmed by some of the more disruptive, mainly US-based developments in this field, which I think are opening a sort of Pandora's box of expectations and half understandings about the process of awards and recognition and how people actually choose to give status to particular types of achievement and qualification. So I'm very impressed by the American credential engine. I don't think it's the last word in dealing with this sort of thing, but what they've done is very sensible. They've it's a not-for-profit database, and what it does is to offer an exhaustive list of characteristics which you could use to define a type of qualification. You could imagine what some of these are to do with assessment or purpose or user or whatever. And it also, it uses them itself to come up with an exhaustive set of types of credential, more than I think are probably absolutely necessary. So that the person who uses the database can take something they've come across, which is offered to them as a credential, and kind of place it within this universe of types of qualification, and have a better understanding of what it is they're being asked to look at or to recognize. In the context of qualifications frameworks, it seems to me that the inclusion or rejection of microcredentials should be dependent on their meeting, as with any other kind of award, the rules which that framework has for the inclusion of qualifications or credentials in the framework. And they will vary, as they do currently, from framework to framework. For example, the Scottish framework, which Julie mentioned earlier and is quite inclusive, would simply say that the microcredential must have clear learning outcomes, a minimum of 10 notional learning hours, formal assessment and recorded assessment, and be subject to both internal and external quality assurance. That's it. And that applies to anything from a degree to a day's training, as it were. And I think I'd look forward to a time when all qualification frameworks could be as open as that. But I don't think the term microcredential, I cannot see how it would ever be a ticket for entry, as it were. It depends what the microcredential is and does and how it's assured and so on. So I support a very broad definition of credential. The credential engine talks, a bit like your definition, Julie, talks about a qualification, record of achievement, or other token attesting to a person's character, conduct, experience, competencies, or capabilities. And I support the approach which uses a broad definition of that kind, but then backs it up by an analysis and a framework which allows you to describe any qualification within a set of agreed terms. And that would help credential evaluators to decide what they would accept, or framework people to decide what would go in the framework or what wouldn't. And the microcredentials, in that case, I think, would actually serve as examples for a range of types of qualification. And therefore, that term itself is not helpful in trying to find our way through the woods of credentials. Thanks.
Thank you. Vijayan, let's get your view and stay on, and I'll pose the next question for you to be the first respondent. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I mean, I want to first say that my response leads on from Herman's probably closing remarks. Around NQFs and the constraints that these policy documents actually place on a particular education system. And I'm of the view that NQF policies should be opened up to provide for these micro-credentialing. And as you know, in the South African space, we introduced what we call skills programs, which now as we talk, or even right here, is linking the two for me in terms of what we were trying to achieve, but calling it not a micro-credential, but a skills program, but essentially meaning the same thing. Coming more pointedly to a definition, I believe that a micro-credential should still embrace all of the elements that we have around what would constitute the formal award of a qualification, or even a part qualification, and that's around the quality assurance part of it. So for me, a micro-credential is proof of a learning outcome or learning outcomes. And I would go further in some way to define those learning outcomes, both in terms of the competency that is attached to that, as well as the skill. And when I talk about this, I'm talking about both the soft skills as well as the hardcore technical skill that's required. And obviously, it has to be looked at through the lens through which the learner has acquired that particular learning experience. And it could be formal, non-formal, informal, but we have to have a measure of what was that learning experience. However, the issue is that these learning outcomes must be assessed against a set of standards, which will then allow the issue of whether it's a credential or a micro-credential that then carries this portability. And it has to be issued by a body that carries the necessary authority to do that, so that there isn't a burden on the learner or the carrier of that micro-credential then, the fact that it is issued by a particular authority that is given the mandate to do such. So I would look at a very broad definition, looking at both the soft skills as well as the hardcore competency skills. And let me just use an example, Julie, if I may say so, if I may do so. I mean, if in the space that the QCTO works in, which is trades, occupations, which makes it very pragmatic, if we look at one qualification, let me call it that, which is a welder, there are different types of welding. You could get a normal arc welder, a gas welder, a steel welder. Now, do we need somebody that is skilled in all of that immediately to meet the needs of the country? But would then qualifying just as a gas welder qualify as a micro-credential towards something that's much larger, and it will then give that learner the opportunity to move to the next part. So it kind of also embraces this element of stacking towards some larger, which is obviously the qualification. So that would be the basic elements towards putting together some definition of a micro-credential.
All right, thank you, panelists. I'm going to go to the last question now, because I really want us to engage with some of the questions which are pouring in. So, and just very quick answers. Do you agree with the view that countries in Europe and North America have different understandings of the definition and usage of credentials and or micro-credentials than South Africa and other countries? And I want to hear, what does this mean for the South African NQF as it relates to the discourse of recognizing non-formal and informal learning, the recognition of learning, the knowledge, skills, competencies, and attributes, flexible learning and assessment pathways, and the recognition of prior learning? I know it's a mouthful, but if you could just tell me what your views are, starting with you, Vijayan.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I mean, you know, I'd be one to argue that maybe yes, there is a particular view, and we heard that in some places, you know, the qualification itself is referred to as the credential. As John indicates, it's very recently that he picked up that there's this word called credential, while others have it more embedded. But I would go as far as to argue that even whether we look at the North or the South, there is these different understandings coming through of these particular terms. What it means for the NQF in South Africa, I would say in particular, it is going to offer us a form of simplification of the way we offer qualifications. And again, I'm putting it within South African context, the high unemployment rate, linking that to issues of the way industry is moving at the rapid pace, the fourth industrial revolution, etc. So this issue of micro-credentialing helps us to address both the bottom end as well as the top end. And when I talk about the top end, I'm talking about upskilling and reskilling. So I'm saying whether these come through normal or informal learning, is just something that we've got to measure, keep an eye on. But I'm also saying that even in terms of recognition of prior learning, again, it does not matter the route that you followed, whether it was formal or non-formal or informal. But again, in the space that we function, a particular competency has to be displayed. And if you are able to display that competency, irrespective of the route that you followed, I think we would be moving much faster in terms of meeting the needs of, and in our particular situation, the economy, and leading to much quicker employment, as well as industry satisfaction at the same time.
Thank you, Vijayan. Herman, can we hear from you? And then the last words from John before we move to the questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I really would like to stress that there is a strong universality in this whole debate. You may like to see differences between the North and the South, but I think they stem from economic factors, not necessarily because the systems per se would oppose any adoption of systems that tend towards what South Africa is doing. You actually see it happening nowadays in many countries in the European Union, probably also in North America, where the shortages of labor simply imply that employers have to look for other ways of recruiting staff that they would previously have disregarded. And what you also see significantly is that major corporations like IBM, other organizations in the US, are actually moving a bit say this discussion will have its up and downs. It's something that is intricately linked to economic developments. But once the North would have applied a way of treating soft skills, micro-credentials, accreditation going to go away afterwards. I mean, this is something needed, and I think we will all be the more grateful in the event that countries would succeed in implementing it in their national qualification frameworks.
Thank you, Herman. John, over to you.
3 points, if I may. The first is that having worked on qualification frameworks in around 20 countries, I think, in different parts of the world, I would say that they all have different understandings of what a qualification or a credential is, and it's not to do with their northness or southness. In fact, even within the UK, which is quite a small geographical area, we have a number of frameworks, but 2 national frameworks. The Scottish one is run by an enabling partnership of awarding bodies, and the English / Northern Irish one has turned into the Register of Regulated Qualifications, and it is run by the Office for Educational Standards. And these differences are social, political, and historical. And I think that's what drives the way that people think about qualifications and indeed about education and training. Second point is that, as Vijay was saying, really the place, pace, and mode of learning should be irrelevant. If we're talking about outcomes, it shouldn't matter where or how or when you achieve them. The question is, can you achieve them and go through the appropriate assessment and so on. So it makes me very sad that the useful terms, formal, non-formal, informal, which I understood you were really introduced to try to open the door to different forms of qualification and credential, are so often used to close the door and to make distinctions and refuse to recognize certain forms of learning and so on. But it does happen, unfortunately. And my final point is that what I would like to edge towards is that there's an issue of whether or how to acknowledge learning which is not formally assessed or certified. And I think Vijay is right in what he said about micro-credentials mainly, but there are some things that are offered micro-credentials which are not formally assessed or whatever. And that was my concern about some of the more commercial developments at the moment. We're already in a world where individuals are able to capture, store, and manage, or in modern terms, curate evidence of their experiences and outcomes digitally. But there are no quality standards to support this. I don't mean technical standards, I mean descriptions, their definitions, and so on. So my final point is that I think today's question, within any jurisdiction, north or south, is how can we assist our stakeholders to understand, collect, and share their useful credentials, whether these are assessed or not assessed, and use their data in an effective way, either through new services, through partnerships, or through alliances. But I would certainly emphasize the need for not only national steps and understandings on this, but for an international perspective to be taken at all times. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'm sorry, I seem to have lost the WhatsApp with all the questions. It suddenly just disappeared from my phone. Ruxana, can I ask you to help me there? I'm not sure what happened. It just suddenly disappeared. I was getting a WhatsApp in here. Ruxana?
Yes, sure, Julie. I've got several questions. Yeah, no, that's fine. I've got several questions here. And I think the first one, as always, comes from James. Can all learning, formal, non-formal, and informal, be codified using learning outcomes? Julie, I'm going to, if it's okay with the panel and yourself, do 3 questions at a time, because we've got loads of questions and we want to make sure that we have sufficient time to answer. And then Bangani wants to know, what is SAQA currently doing to encourage the recognition of all achievements in South Africa? So quite a broad question around SAQA and how you're looking at recognition of achievements. Sibelelo wants the panel to address the matter of the role and responsibility of industry, organized employers, organized labor, both perspectives. So I'll leave it at those 3 questions, Julie. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me ask the panelists first for the general question, and then I'll answer the SAQA question. Any of the panelists can come in and just respond if you think the question, you have a response to the question. Herman, go ahead.
Interesting question by James. My first impression immediately was, well, there's nothing against coding learning outcomes for formal, non-formal, informal per se, but it's of course a financial issue. I mean, whereas the formal education system routinely provides the funding for all these things. There is no such thing for non-formal or informal, or at least it's a very limited supply of money. I think that's a very defining factor. That's all I can share. I mean, I'm not an expert in these things. I would rather look to John to what you call proceed on this.
John, you can come in and then maybe Vijayan can answer the Sibelelo's question. John?
Okay. I think I'm very impressed, actually. I'm very old, and I started working on learning outcomes in the 1990s. And it seemed to be a very restricted kind of thing that could be done with them. But I was hugely impressed over the time after that, in the way that different bodies with different aims and values and requirements came forward and used learning outcomes to work with their system. And in particular, professional bodies, and particular the health service, have always impressed me in the way that they managed to build into their standards and their qualifications ethical issues, social issues, the need for people to have a very inclusive understanding of partnership and relationships, how to deal with not only patients, but also relatives and others in situations which can be very stressful, and so on. And that's just one example. I think to me, that's probably the best example of how a full set of dimensions of learning and ways of acting in a particular profession have built on the perhaps very crude notion of what a learning outcome might be. So I see no reason to think that it's not possible to capture most learning in that way. On the other hand, coming back to the idea of non-assessed, there are also forms of descriptions of what people have done or experienced or learned, which don't learn themselves, not so much to outcomes descriptions, but to assessment or the gathering of evidence. And I think we need to look a bit more widely at how we steer something between the formal degree and the LinkedIn profile to get credible ways of describing what people have actually achieved and can do. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Vijayan, Sibelelo's question.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I mean, Sibelelo, the short answer is yes. The industry does have a very critical role to play as obviously the recipients of the learners that come through the system. But I think the challenge for me is we have to look at the level of organization of this industries that we are talking about. In more advanced labor market, there's very close ties between what happens between the education sector and the actual employment sector, and there you would have very tight relationships. So for me, I'm saying yes, there is a role for industry, but again,
You are muted, Roxana.
Yes, sure, Julie. Would you like me to go through that question from Lizelle? Can you hear me?
Yeah, but I think we might run out of time. Roxana, I think we'll try and answer it in the chat. Let me just answer the SAQA question and then close, because I know the next session is in a few minutes. So let me and we'll try to answer the other questions in the chat. So what is SAQA doing about other types of learning? You will know, Bongani, that for a long time, a key priority going back over 20 years is our focus on recognition of prior learning. How do we make learning non-formal, formal, and informal visible and recognize it? So, we have RPL policies, And I think we are quite advanced in the world in terms of in our new policies. So as John said, I think John made a very important point. Our policies and practices for keeping people out or bringing people in. And I think it does relate to the issue that Lizelle brought in about workers. How do we recognize their credentials broadly, not only qualifications, their abilities to do things and know work outside of a qualifications construct. And I think RPL is a key enabler, RPL for access, RPL for credit. We do have our detractors, as we know, in our country. So it's not an easy process because we seem to be held hostage to the formal academy, that only qualifications that are you know, in the formal academy needs to be recognized and, you know, certified. But I think we are trying to lobby and explain that RPL does not mean that standards get thrown out of the window, that quality is compromised. It is just another mechanism to put your portfolio of evidence together, and it's another mechanism to assess learning against the same learning outcomes and then, you know, recognize the learning. So that's one area. We are involved in quite expansive debates at SAQA about learning that does not lead to certificates or are quality assured or are assessed. How do we recognize that? We are talking about possibly a fourth sub-framework where we can do this, talk about the skills program, how the world sees credentials and micro-credentials. So Bongani, with that response, I'm just going to quickly summarize before we close the session. I want to thank our panelists. I think you raised some excellent issues. I think obviously what you are telling us is that it is very contextually specific, that I think all of us agree that we don't necessarily disagree with these terms in principle, credentials, micro-credentials, but that we need to be very careful of how it is being defined and used in our particular educational context. John's point that we notice the emphasis on formal qualifications and how we are challenged by definitions of qualifications. And whenever you attach anything to a construct that exists for a number of years and is there in the space and taken almost for granted or assumed to be in place, you have to defend it against the dominant paradigm or construct. He mentioned the work of the credential engine, and I think we need to look at that because it seems to be a more expansive way to do things. We all have to revisit our notions of what is learning, how we recognize it and its suitability. We need to look at lessons learned for our particular context. I think Vijayan raised that quite forcefully. Our contextual realities and need is key. So there's no one size fits all, and we mustn't overcomplicate our education and training system. Herman, that we're not against, you know, the terminology itself, but we need to define and adapt this term and how we use it, and in the principles of exclusion and exclusion and that whole debate. I see it's 10:29. Roxana, thank you very much. I will stop there. Thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you so much, Julie, Herman, Vijayan, and John. This was a really interesting discussion. It's always great when people come into this discussion from different experiences, different ideas, sometimes opposing thoughts, yet manage to lead the discussion in such a substantive way. I think these inputs will give rise to even more new discussions after the conference. It reminds me of the early years, Julie, when we debated stackable credits towards full qualifications and the universities struggled to agree with that train of thought. So bringing back this discussion on the table, but with a different perspective, opens up these debates. So thank you for that.